Illuminati Unmasked by Johnny Cerrucci.
Chapter 9. The Clinton Years, when the false flag was perfected.
Here now is Johnny Cerrucci.
In 1975, a university professor by the name of Carroll Quigley published an unusual 1,300-page treatise on the agenda of the ruling elite entitled Tragedy and Hope. It would later be read by some of the most powerful people in the world. For instance, on the power of the banking family cartels, Quigley tells us, the names of some of these banking families are familiar to all of us and should be more so. They include Baring, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg, Schroeder, the Spires, Mirbaud, Fold, and above all, Rothschild and Morgan. Pause. Meanwhile, the real bankers, the Templars, the Medicis, and the Farnese escape the attention of this Jesuit professor. Even after these banking families became fully involved in domestic industry by the emergence of financial capitalism, they remained different from ordinary bankers. They were almost equally devoted to secrecy and the secret use of financial influence in political life. These bankers came to be called international bankers and more particularly were known as merchant bankers in England, private bankers in France, and investment bankers in the United States. One of their less obvious characteristics was that they remained as private, unincorporated firms, usually partnerships, until relatively recently, offering no shares, no reports, and usually no advertising to the public. This persistence as private firms continued because it ensured the maximum anonymity and secrecy to persons of tremendous public power who dreaded public knowledge of their activities. So says the professor at Jesuit Georgetown. And on the secret control of nations by central banks, he says, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. Does that sound like globalist bankers or papists? The apex of the system was to be the Bank for the International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations, each central bank in the hands of men like Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve, Charles Rist of the Bank of France, and Halimar Schacht of the Reichsbank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence the cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. In each country, the power of the central bank resetted largely on its, I think that should be rested, control of credit and money supply. And by the way, what he meant with cooperating with politicians was kickbacks. And if you want to see how that works, just look at how rich, how filthy rich some of Americans' Roman Catholic leftist politicians are, from Nancy Pelosi to Joe Biden. On the existence of secret societies which subvert democracy, Quigley tells us, there does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communists act. Radical right. What a fraud. Only someone like this could teach at a Jesuit school, particularly Georgetown. In fact, this network, which may identify as the Round Table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with communists or any other groups and frequently does so. Pause aside. Of course, that's because the Catholic Church created communism. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 60s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of its instruments. I'll bet you didn't realize that Quigley had said that or had even heard that Quigley had said that. This is at the same time as not telling you who the real power brokers and puppet masters are. On political so-called choice, Quigley states, the chief problem of American political life for a long time has been how to make the two congressional parties more national and international. The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea acceptable only to the doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical. Should they, Carol? How about they are, because of your masters? Back to my text. On page 968, Quigley mentions a connection of finance from London to New York that penetrated deeply into university life, the press, and the practice of foreign policy. If there is any secret organization that has its hands deeply into university life, extending out to foreign policy, it is the Company of Loyola. This line would coalesce to become a triumvirate. Slave labor and goods from communist China, London is the hub of finance, and Washington, D.C., the coercive military force behind the agenda. The head of this triumvirate appears to be Rome. In 1992, Bill Clinton would thank Carroll Quigley in his speech of acceptance to run for presidency of the United States.
As a teenager, I heard John Kennedy's summons to citizenship. And then, as a student at Georgetown, I heard that call clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley.
Clinton was chosen early and brought before then-President Kennedy via the American Legion's Boys Nation program. It was as a student at Georgetown that Clinton learned from Professor Carroll Quigley. The Jesuit institution is proud of them both. This taken from the Clinton Lectures of the Georgetown University. Clinton has often noted as major influences his professors at Georgetown, particularly the late Carroll Quigley, Reverend Joseph Steebs, Society of Jesus, as well as Reverend Otto Hentz, also a Jesuit, who still teaches at Georgetown. Hentz asked the young Clinton, a Baptist, if he had considered becoming a Jesuit. The professor has said he believes the curriculum and the Catholic and Jesuit influence at Georgetown had a profound influence on the future president. There is a direct line of empowering from George Bush to Bill Clinton to George Bush as presidents of the United States, and it is composed of a powdery white substance. Gary Webb was a reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, and he was unique in his field. He was a real reporter. Webb originally started to make the front page by covering the story of a convicted drug trafficker who began racking up lawsuit wins based upon the idea that being imprisoned and having property confiscated was judicial double jeopardy. As Gary himself would later note in his book Dark Alliance, faced with the prospect of setting thousands of dopers free or returning billions in seized property, the United States Supreme Court would later overturn two of its own rulings in order to kill off the inmate's suit. 2 years earlier, I'd written a series for the Mercury called The Forfeiture Racket about the police in California busting into private homes and taking furniture, televisions, Nintendo games, belt buckles, welfare checks, snow tires, and loose change under the guise of cracking down on drug traffickers. Many times they'd never filed charges, or the charges would be dropped once the victims signed over the loot. A woman got in touch with Webb after reading his work to see if he would help her imprisoned boyfriend. He, too, had been thrown in jail and had his property confiscated. But there was a new twist. He had information that the organization behind the trafficking was the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, they brought a CIA trafficker to court to help convict the man. Again, reading from Dark Alliance, the CIA. He used to work for them or something. He's a Nicaraguan, too. Raphael knows him. He can tell you. He told me the guy he had admitted bringing 4 tons of cocaine into the country. 4 tons! And if that's what he's admitted to, you can imagine how much it really was. Now he's back working for the government again. The star government witness turned out to be Oscar Danilo Blandon, a Nicaraguan drug pimp who was covering Los Angeles in cocaine. This sounded incredulous, so Webb did his homework. Now, there were two separate sources saying in court that Blandon had involved himself with the Contras and had been selling large amounts of cocaine in Los Angeles. And when the government finally had a chance to put him away forever, it had opened up the cell doors and let him walk. Few Americans know that cocaine smuggling was the grease that moved the cogs within the Iran-Contra scandal. Getting weapons secretly to Nicaraguan Contras was the purview of retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. North would work arm in arm with CIA Director George H.W. Bush on Readiness Exercise 1984, also known as Rex 84, along with Jesuit Boston College alum Louis Giuffrida of FEMA as a plan for complete suspension of constitutional rights during an emergency situation in the United States.
As head of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Giuffrida was an old cold warrior from Reagan's California days whose specialty was suppression of unrest and dissent. Giuffrida, North, and George Bush began to turn FEMA into an instrument of domestic anti-terrorism.
You're dealing with a group of people in the Reagan administration who equated political dissent with treason and who cannot differentiate between emergency procedures, which I think everyone agrees are necessary, and suppressing political dissent. And with North and Poindexter and Casey, you had a group of people who saw Americans who disagree with them as the enemy.
Colonel North, in your work at the NSC, were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir.
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution. And I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked. I believe that it was,
may I most respectfully request that that matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we wish to get into this, I'm certain arrangements can be made for an executive session.
And tragically, the only member who got close was Jack Brooks, and he was stopped by the chairman.
Uncovering cocaine trafficking by the CIA launched Gary Webb into a three-part series of columns that were an instant success despite his being constantly attacked by both the government and his media peers.
Yeah, and that's sort of the tragedy of all this is that, and one of the points that the Esquire piece makes is how there is a long record of CIA involvement with suspected drug traffickers and drug trafficking organizations. And this is a history that's mostly unknown to the American public. What I tried to do, and I think we could have done it better in the original series, was show that this situation involving the Contras in Los Angeles dealing dope to the gangs was not an isolated incident. It wasn't an aberration. There have been reports of CIA involvement with drug traffickers all the way back to the secret war in Laos. There's a whole book written by Professor Alfred McCoy called The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, which the CIA actually went to court and tried to prevent from being printed back in the 70s, about the CIA's involvement with Laotian drug traffickers. And here was, you know, this story, I think, showed what happens when you get in bed with those kind of people. The results are sometimes unintended, and I think in this case, this was a case, you know, this stuff happens so often, the CIA has a word for it, it's called blowback. It's what happens when you do something overseas that comes back and blows up in the face of the American public. And in the case of the Contra War, you had a situation where we got in bed with drug traffickers. There was a story, which I frankly never thought I would see on the front page of the New York Times, and I think it was July 17th, in which the Times reported that the CIA now admits that they had relationships with about 24 drug traffickers during the Contra War, and continued the relationships even after being told that there was evidence these men were trafficking drugs.
Webb would later be found dead and ruled a suicide by the coroner, despite there being 2 bullet wounds to his head. it has been revealed that media attacks on Webb were coordinated by the CIA to destroy Webb's reputation. 9 years after investigative reporter Gary Webb committed suicide, and of course this clown doesn't have any apostrophes around that, Jesse Katz, a former Los Angeles Times reporter, you can guess what religion Jesse is if you don't know what I mean by that. Rome loves to hide behind those who are Jewish. Jesse Katz, a former Los Angeles Times reporter who played a leading role in ruining the controversial journalist's career. Pause. There's absolutely nothing controversial about Gary Webb except that he actually did his job. Has publicly apologized just weeks before shooting begins in Atlanta on Kill the Messenger, a film expected to reinstate Webb's reputation as an award-winning journalist, dragged through the mud by disdainful competing media outlets. And look, I don't promote anything out of Hollywood. Hollywood is purely satanic, but look, if you want any kind of entertainment, and it's absolutely impossible to live as a hermit, you're gonna have to watch something. And I do recommend Jeremy Renner's Kill the Messenger, although it still had spin. Nearly 20 years later, Gary Webb's story is starting to gain traction. It should be noted, however, that all political figures involved are well out of office. A movie starring Jeremy Renner was released in 2014 about Webb's story titled Kill the Messenger.
Gary Webb, San Jose Mercury News.
You believe in conspiracy theories, Gary?
No, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. Conspiracies, yes. If I believe it, there's nothing theory about it.
Was the government aware that you were smuggling tons of cocaine into the United States?
Yes, the government knew.
This leads to very sensitive national security matters.
National security and crack cocaine in the same sentence. Does that not sound strange to you?
I'm going to tell you the whole truth. I'm going to introduce you to people you should talk to. And then you will be faced with the most important decision of your life.
Oh, yeah? What's that?
Deciding whether to share it or not.
One of the DEA's most wanted brought in thousands of kilos of cocaine to the U.S. every day. For them.
For who?
The U.S. government. Or with them. Or at least while they were looking the other way.
Jesus.
L.A., New York, Atlanta. I couldn't sell it fast enough to keep up with supply.
Fancy information you have there. Dangerous. What you found here, Gary, is a monster. You have no idea what you're getting into.
Are you really telling me that I should just walk away from this?
You'd be an idiot not to.
This story scares people.
I'm your big brother.
Well, it should.
Be careful.
There are ongoing operations you're in danger of exposing.
We know you were in Nicaragua.
Am I being followed?
I heard they found a solution. Where will you be for the revolution?
I thought my job was to tell the public the truth, the facts, pretty or not. And let the publishing of those facts make a difference in how people look at things, at themselves, and what they stand for.
We'd never threaten your children, Mr. Webb.
What'd you say?
It's over.
I'm not finished with it! I'm not finished! This is a true story. Some stories are just too true to tell.
Where you be for the revolution?
Smuggling cocaine into the United States required skilled pilots with superior technological aids for radio transmissions and deception. One of the men conducting that mission was Adler Berryman Seal. During the 1990s, Barry Seal was using advanced radar and communication gear the CIA had given him to fly drugs and weapons in and out of a little airport in Mena, Arkansas. There were some original difficulties with the local authorities, but the governor was quickly brought in on the operation and began to enjoy large amounts of cash and coke for himself, his family, and his administration. That governor was William Jefferson Clinton. One of the pilots that helped Barry Seal was also training Nicaraguans to fly supplies in and out of their country from that same base of operations in Mena. Terry K. Reed stated his government service as an Air Force intelligence analyst in Vietnam is where it began. He would go on to write a scathing expose based upon his experiences titled Compromised, and the story started with his own deal with the devil. While conducting bombing damage assessments, Reed was brought in on the secret that the North Vietnamese were lining their supply routes with American prisoners of war and POW camps. The military targeted them all anyway. Reed was told by his commanding officer, "Help plan the missions, or we'll ship you out in disgrace and bring in someone who will." He helped with the bombings and never forgave himself. This experience propelled Reed to turn whistleblower after his other experiences with the CIA and MENA and beyond. I can attest to something that I, like others, had often wondered about. Does the CIA sponsor candidates to the office of United States President? The answer is yes. I witnessed the creation of a counterfeit president. After Reed published his tell-all book, he was disappointed to see the media cover up the story or attack it whenever it was referenced. He considered it a liberal bias, and for the bulk of media organizations that may have been true, but controlling information is easy when only 6 megacorporations decide what news is. The CIA conducting operations on U.S. soil is illegal, but it was and is done anyway. Recall that current director was sworn in on a Constitution minus the Bill of Rights. That's Jesuit-trained John O. Brennan, the drone executioner. Not only was the CIA running guns out and cocaine in from the U.S. to Nicaragua, but they were stealing assault weapons from the Army and National Guard to do it, as well as making illegal weapons in Arkansas. What is an assault weapon? A true assault weapon is a shoulder-fired firearm capable of shooting calibers larger than normally found in a handgun, that's a submachine gun, and either has a selector control, lever, or button to alternate between semi and automatic fire, or simply shoots fully automatic. The Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, remember to invert the name of a piece of legislation to understand what it does, which Ronald Reagan signed into law, made these weapons exorbitantly expensive, and now only the wealthy elite have the ability to own one. This is in stark contrast to the strict restrictions on Americans trying to exercise their Second Amendment rights. The right to keep and bear arms was never intended to be anything less than a citizen check on government tyranny. Every proponent of so-called gun control knows this, from Charles Schumer, the Democrat far-left Jew in New York, to another Democrat far-left Jew, Dianne Feinstein in California, and she's Catholic trained, by the way, to Barack Obama. Dianne Feinstein being trained in Sacred Heart Convent before helping to cover the murder of Jesuit-trained San Francisco Mayor George Moscone. She took over from Moscone in 1978. Moscone murdered by Roman Catholic Dan White, who also murdered homosexual Harvey Milk. And this was all related to incognito Jesuit Jim Jones, who worked as an official for Moscone. Jones, a good friend in all the Democrat circles in California, along with Jesuit seminarian, probably ordained Jesuit. We're told he never was ordained. The once and future governor, Jerry Moonbeam Brown. So when Catholic trolls try to derail the conversation with me and throw out how much there are Jews at fault, I immediately bring up examples like Dianne Feinstein and a great many other Jews who are Catholic or Jesuit educated, whereas the reverse is unheard of. In fact, if you want to be Jewish educated, I don't even know where you would go. Not only are there, I think, 28 overt Jesuit schools all around the world, I think that's just in America, confiscating far-left Jews in government. Their arguments for safety and common sense ring hollow in light of the frightening advances in government power, intrusion, and enforcement. Nearly every single federal agency has its own SWAT team and armored vehicles. One founding father who has been erased from history knew quite well the purpose of the Second Amendment. Tench Coxe was a merchant who had been accused of doing business with the British, but upon seeing their heavy-handed disarming of Americans wherever they went, became an outspoken patriot. He served as a delegate from Pennsylvania to the Constitutional Convention and was a member of the Madison and Jefferson administrations. Cox had this to say about gun control. As civil rulers, not having their duty to the people before them, may attempt to tyrannize, and as the military forces which must be occasionally raised to defend our country might pervert their power to the injury of their fellow citizens, the people are confirmed by the article in their right to keep and bear their private arms. Who are the militia? Are they not ourselves? Is it feared then that we shall turn our arms each man against his own bosom? Congress has no power to disarm the militia. Their swords and every other terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of an American. The unlimited power of the sword is not in the hands of either the federal or the state governments, but where I trust in God, it will ever remain in the hands of the people. Disarming the middle class is a key component of the Counter-Reformation. In this effort, one of the Vatican's most valuable allies has been the Catholic Connecticut Dodd family. The following is a citation from Newsweek. Chris Dodd grew up in a large Irish Catholic family, listening to his father's tales of crusading for justice. Thomas Dodd had chased the Dillinger Gang as an FBI agent and prosecuted Nazi war criminals and the Ku Klux Klan as a government lawyer. As a United States Senator from Connecticut in the 50s and 60s, he was a protege of Lyndon Baines Johnson and was seriously considered as his running mate in 1964. But in June of 67, Dodd was censured by his Senate colleagues in a 92-5 vote for allegedly diverting more than $100,000 of his campaign funds for personal use. Thomas Dodd was promoted as a vehement FBI Nazi fighter, yet as a United States Senator, he would use the 1938 Nazi Gun Control Act as the basis for his 1968 gun control legislation, forced into law with the help of the CIA assassination of John F. Kennedy. Dodd had originally offered the bill shortly after Kennedy's killing in '64, but it did not get through committee. Like so many other bad pieces of legislation, Dodd would continue to bring the bill back until weak opposition from the National Rifle Association allowed it to pass in 1968. That's what the NRA does best. Controlled opposition, lay down, roll over. Chris Dodd would pick up where his father Thomas Dodd left off, helping to engineer a staggering housing bubble that burst all over the American taxpayer. Instead of being prosecuted, he was rewarded. The top three names that received political contributions from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were in this order: Dodd, Obama, Kerry. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are government banks that specialize in giving out loans for mortgages, but of course with strings attached and massive amounts of corruption. Family has been ruling Americans for Rome for 60 years. In 2011, Chris Dodd would finally leave Congress for one of the few endeavors even more lucrative, Hollywood. Dodd is now chairman and CEO of the Motion Picture Association of America, which I just told you. It is a foregone conclusion that he is still working for the same masters. The Clinton administration was finding that cooperating with the CIA had its perks. They had negotiated to take a dime off every Coke dollar, and Barry Seal was literally kicking duffel bags loaded with cash out of his Piper Seneca into the waiting arms of Clinton fundraiser Dan Lasater. Although Lasater would later be thrown to the wolves, as so many inconsequential figures have been for the illusion of justice, and convicted of drug trafficking, Bill Clinton would quickly pardon him because he needed his Second Amendment rights to go hunting. Unimportant issues like Lasater drugging and deflowering a teenage girl were quickly swept aside. It pays to be on the ruling team. As Terry Reid got more deeply into the MENA operation, he began to have some doubts, which he brought to his Japanese national CIA handler, Aki Sawahata. Aki, is all this legal? Sounds like we're going to great lengths to avoid detection by other feds. Who do we consider our enemy here? Terry-san, we are CIA. We are not law enforcement. We are not Justice Department. We are not Treasury Department. We are CIA. We answer to Director, who answer to President. You are dealing with very top level. These other agencies not in loop. They're not clear for major foreign policy decision. CIA has to work this all over world. We are not breaking law. We are above law. You know, a great movie on this is the Steven Seagal movie Above the Law, which, as usual, dances close to the truth, but never gives you the big picture. In the movie, Roman Catholic clergy are victims just trying to help the poor illegal aliens and getting blown up. But the truth that you get is how deeply involved the CIA is in drug trafficking.
I figured you'd do your recon from this building.
You're looking fit, Nelson.
Getting a bit of a tire.
Is that your own tailor?
Hong Kong.
You've come a long way.
Yeah. Just walk.
I don't believe you, Nelson.
What's so hard to believe? I want to help you, you dumb guinea. I've been trying to talk some sense into you.
Hey, you still Fox the Fixer, huh?
Look, if I wanted to cap you, I'd save myself all this damn chit-chat. Make big points for myself if I brought your scalp in. Should I be White House material?
Is that what Zagon is, one of your basement boys?
Zagon's a rancher, 4,000 acres in Costa Rica. Beautiful place.
Beautiful place, huh? And tell me, was that bought with opium money from the Triangle?
And a ton of coke a week from other places.
Which he funnels here through Salvano. Company getting its cut, of course.
Legal tender.
Yeah. So war is still the greatest business, huh, Nelson? I mean, these guys have started and financed every war we've ever fought. But you know something? Nobody would ever believe me if I told them the bankers on the CIA.
Oh, come on, Toscani, don't preach to me.
So the senator couldn't be bought, could he? He was going to expose your plans to invade Nicaragua with your fucking coke money. So the agency clears Zagon to cap his ass, right?
Just keep walking, asshole.
So some poor innocent priest finds out he comes here, but you can't kill the senator until you find out if the Padres talked. So Zagon comes in, tell me, with this little doctor bag, only by then I'm in on it. And you fucking know that I'm gonna recognize his handiwork.
Yeah, and if your name had been Joe Smith, I never would have caught it, but how many Niccolo Toscanis are there?
Tell me something, old buddy. We kill our own senators now?
Why not? The Romans did.
Are we the fucking Romans?
We're an empire, too.
You don't believe that shit for a minute, Nelson.
Just walk.
Oh, I forgot another part of this psychological operation of that movie. See, you can't ever have a movie that tells the whole truth, but you can have these rare movies that dance closer to the truth than much usually is allowed. Yeah, the senator couldn't be bought. There's not a national official that isn't thoroughly controlled, corrupted, owned. Working hand in hand with the Democrats in Arkansas during the 1980s were the Republicans in D.C., specifically the Bush family. In George Herbert Walker Bush's hip pocket was deadly Cuban hitman Felix Ismael Rodriguez. Rodriguez worked closely with E. Howard Hunt on Operation 40, the failed invasion of Cuba, as well as being sent on several high-profile missions, including a failed attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro. The CIA was unstoppable except when it came to Jesuit-trained Catholic communist Fidel Castro. Then they were hapless and incompetent. He is suspected of also having been involved in John F. Kennedy's assassination. When the CIA caught up with Ernesto Che Guevara, Felix Rodriguez was there to interrogate him before he was executed. As Guevara bled out, Rodriguez took the Rolex watch off of his wrist and proudly displayed it to anyone who was interested for the rest of his life. Rodriguez was also in Mina helping Terry Reid train Nicaraguan rebels. Why would a bunch of hard-left Democrats who had masqueraded as Southern Blue Dog Democrats to get to the governor's mansion in Arkansas work with silver spoon Republican elites to run guns and drugs to Nicaragua to oust a leftist government? The more Terry Reid worked with them all, the more he sensed that his world paradigm was terribly flawed. The media, presidential elections, even elections for key legislators, it was all a farce. A rigged game. Here was what seemed a strange alliance, a state run by Democrats in bed with a Republican administration in Washington, and both conspiring to evade Congress's prohibition against aiding or abetting the Contras. It was so steeped with hypocrisy. Was the CIA the invisible force that had the power to compromise these political pillars of the nation? Were these same invisible forces operating only in Arkansas or throughout the nation? He wondered. But why limit it to the nation? Perhaps the world functioned under one control. Could the control be the CIA? Was there a secret alliance of agents worldwide who operated as they pleased? Pause. As an aside, we know the right answer. Did Terry know the right answer and just keep it to himself? Religion, he had come to realize, was a form of social control. Was politics as well? Was it just a game like professional sports, simply to divert public attention from what was really happening? Was it all just a placebo? While driving back to OSI, the CIA logistical front company overseas international, Terry was strangely quiet and withdrawn. He was feeling manipulated by the social order he had been raised to obey, and now he had doubts about his previous motivations in life. Again, let's pause. Is this so-called social order Roman Catholicism? I'll bet you it is. "You're very quiet, Terry-san," Reed's CIA handler Aki Sawahata said after a few minutes. "Aki, I've got to ask you a question. It's funny, I've never asked, considering all the time we spent together. Are you a Republican or a Democrat?" "I am plinto atheist. I work for CIA." "What does that mean?" "That mean agency is politics. Agency is government. Everything else just puppets. Big game, Terry-san. You did not know that?" If Terry Reed was not a liability before, he certainly was now. Those who see behind the curtain are always a threat. But those who feared him would not pull the trigger themselves. They would not resort to such dirty mob-style methods. They would use a much more clean, convenient, and safe way to terminate him. Simply manufacture a criminal profile, construct a crime, and let the system do the rest. Reed would find that, when irritated, the United States government could simply use its internal resources to eliminate an asset. While working in the machine tool industry in Oklahoma, Reed was brought in by the local FBI office to help investigate the shady dealings of Soviet citizen Joseph Bona. Bona was a Hungarian KGB agent who spoke 7 languages and, according to Special Agent Wayne Buzz Barlow, was responsible for the deaths of at least 3 international spies. Bona was helping export critical technology through his KGB front company, Techno-Impex, and an affiliated American company, Northwest Industries. Reed noted, "The Soviets didn't have to steal the technology they desperately needed and couldn't produce. They simply had to come to America and buy it. And the Japanese were more than willing to do business, even if they didn't own what they were selling. What the Japanese couldn't provide them, the KGB was apparently going to procure through legitimate business ties they were establishing in North America." In 1987, it was discovered that Toshiba had sold important submarine stealth technology, specifically the ability to precision machine submarine propellers to reduce cavitation, to the Soviet Union. It produced some great political theater as legislators hit Toshiba radios with sledgehammers for the unwitting American public. Less than a year later, not only were all modest penalties against Toshiba erased, the skids for foreign trading had gotten thoroughly greased. And it's Jewish journalist Robert Rosenblatt. It was only last July that 8 sledgehammer-wielding members of Congress smashed a Toshiba radio cassette recorder on the Capitol grounds to protest the company's illegal sale of submarine technology to the Soviet Union. Pause and Capitol as in Capitoline Hill in Rome. The Senate, acting on its version of an omnibus trade bill, quickly voted to ban the Japanese manufacturing giant from its lucrative $2.5 billion a year U.S. market. And one House member said Toshiba deserved a Benedict Arnold Traders Award. Pause. They'll never do that again. But now the burst of anger has dissipated under the impact of one of the most pervasive and sophisticated lobbying efforts in Washington in many years. The version of the trade bill that cleared the Senate last week and the House the week before nearly obliterates the punishment for Toshiba by limiting the ban to its annual $200 million in sales to the United States government. Terry Reid would also find that Joseph Bona weathered his FBI investigation without a hitch. In fact, the United States government was excited to hear Reid say he wanted to cooperate with the KGB agent on manufacturing illicit weapons in Mexico. High-level officials in the United States government were enabling the Soviet Union to overcome the stifling chains of communism and keep strategic parity with America, and the very intelligence agencies that were supposed to protect from espionage were helping to get the job done. Emery West, the president of NWI, Northwest International, and a former Hungarian refugee, was deeply involved with the CIA, FBI, and KGB. Soon, Reid was having dinner with Bona, and the arrangement was making him have that queer feeling of being manipulated again. A myriad of thoughts raced through Terry's head. Here he was dining with someone he was sure was a communist agent, a man he liked to be sure, but a communist agent nonetheless. And Terry was fronting for the CIA, another strange alliance. He had looked behind the curtain in Arkansas and seen that American politics was a charade. Was geopolitics a charade too, he wondered? A conspiracy this big implies leadership within all organizations were dancing to a tune played by an outside malignant musician. Rome. Barry Seal had told his CIA daredevil pilot partner Terry Reid that he had a blackmail insurance policy to keep him wealthy and alive. He had caught the sons of the president doing and selling drugs. This from Compromised. Barry, are you telling me George Bush's kids are in the drug business? Yep, that's what I'm telling you. A guy in Florida who flipped for the DEA has got the goods on the Bush boys. Now, I heard this earlier from a reliable source in Colombia, but I just sat on it then, waiting to use it as a trump card. Even got some tape recordings, expletive. I even got surveillance videos catching the Bush boys red-handed. I consider this stuff my insurance policy. It makes me and my mole on the inside that's feeding the stuff to me invincible. Now, this is real sensitive shit inside of a U.S. Customs and DEA, and those guys are pretty much under control. So what Barry Seal didn't take into account was how easily the players he thought he was pitting against each other could reconcile. They all answered to a higher authority who kept them in line and out of trouble. This was obvious as the CIA repeatedly colluded with their supposed arch-nemesis, the KGB. Barry Seal could not possibly have imagined that between the Clinton and Bush camps was a voice they all obeyed. Because of this, not only was it easy to tie up the loose ends, it was a combined effort. In 1985, Seal gave testimony to the Presidential Commission on Organized Crime.
Flew into these areas by helicopter. We dropped the cocaine by parachute in a totally inaccessible swampy area in Louisiana. And the helicopter then proceeded to the pickup point, loaded the helicopter with the cocaine. The airplane would then turn around and either go back to Mexico or Colombia, proceed uneventfully, unloaded, no problems, to any normal airport in the United States.
His testimony was then used against him, and the Internal Revenue Service slapped a $29 million jeopardy tax assessment on him, stripping him of all his property. District Court Judge Frank Palazzola sentenced Seal to evening confinement at Baton Rouge, the Louisiana Salvation Army halfway house. The only thing the judge didn't do was paint a bullseye on Seal's back. He was perfectly anchored to the same public place every evening until morning, and that's exactly where a Medellin hit team riddled him with bullets on February 19th, 1986. Wikipedia states, false flag or a black flag describes covert military or paramilitary operations designed to deceive in such a way that the operations appear as though they are being carried out by entities, groups, or nations other than those who actually planned and executed them. Operations carried out during peacetime by civilian organizations as well as covert government agencies may, by extension, be called false flag operations if they seek to hide the real organization behind an operation. Geraint Hughes uses the term to refer to those acts carried out by military or security force personnel, which are then blamed on terrorists. In 64 AD, Rome suffered a terrible fire that burned for nearly a week and destroyed 75% of the city. Citizens suspected that Emperor Nero had started it, but instead he scapegoated the troublesome and burgeoning population of New Christians. At the turn of the century, Cuba was an allure to American business for trade in sugar and iron. The elite were eager to rid the hemisphere of Spanish influence, and the sinking of the USS Maine and loss of her 266 sailors was the catalyst for war. However, controversy swirls around the grave of the warship to this day, and the original government explanation of a Spanish mine no longer holds water. In May of 1915, a German U-boat sank the ocean liner RMS Lusitania, and she lost an astounding 1,195 passengers to the icy waters of the Atlantic. It was an outrage that was called to mind repeatedly by politicians and media alike until America joined World War I less than 2 years later. What was discovered well afterward was that it was the American and British governments that put those passengers at risk by loading the Lusitania with arms for the war. In 1932, Germany's political landscape was strewn with schisms caused by competing parties and interests. In January the following year, German President Paul von Hindenburg appointed the powerful Nazi Party's Adolf Hitler as chancellor. Hitler was extremely ambitious, but had learned from his failed strong-arm coup of a decade earlier. Less than 2 months after becoming chancellor, Germany's building of parliament, the Reichstag, burned to the ground. German communists were blamed, and the Führer was a wave of emotion that Hitler rode into becoming Führer. Few now dispute that Nazis started the blaze. Success breeds success, and 6 years later, Der Führer had his eyes on Poland. In late August of 1939, the German secret police, the Gestapo, located an isolated radio outpost along the Silesian border near the town of Gleiwitz. The 3 operators were subdued by Poles, and the radio station was taken over and began broadcasting a message of Polish resistance that likely no one heard because it was only a relay station. Later, a Polish sympathizer was dragged by the Gestapo in a drugged state to the location, where he was executed as proof of the aggression. A few days later after that, in September, Germany invaded Poland. Remember the Maine. In 1962, members of the United States military recommended to President John F. Kennedy that innocent Americans be murdered, and communist Cubans could be blamed as provocation for war with Cuba. In the most perverse sense of irony, Operation Northwoods even offered to blow up a U.S. warship in Guantanamo Bay, creating a new take on Spanish philosopher Jorge Santayana's famous phrase, "Those who are oblivious to history are doomed to repeat it." Some have pondered whether Kennedy's refusal contributed to his assassination. In 1964, American aid to South Vietnam was only in the form of advisors and special operations units. After a series of attacks on the Navy destroyer USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, Congress gave Lyndon Johnson carte blanche to send tens of thousands of young men to be maimed and killed for a massive new military-industrial complex.
Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Later it was found no such attacks ever occurred. Pause. Since writing this, my suspicious connections to the Navy commander in the Tonkin Gulf at the time, Admiral George Morrison, the father of Doors lead singer Jim Morrison. And here I can recommend Dave McGowan's work on how the government and the CIA was involved in almost all of the top bands of the drug era in the 60s. Now, Dave will never give you the tie-in to Rome, which is the critical big picture that I give you, but it's some great work on that piece of the puzzle. In 1967, Johnson would again be implicated in the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty. We'll take a detailed look at that in Chapter 17. A well-cited column from Washington's blog lists these further examples. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev admitted in writing that the Soviet Union's Red Army shelled the Russian village of Manila in 1939 and declared that the fire originated from Finland as a basis for launching the Winter War 4 days later. The CIA admits that it hired Iranians in the 1950s to pose as communists and stage bombings in Iran in order to turn the country against its democratically elected prime minister. The former Italian prime minister, an Italian judge, and the former head of Italian counterintelligence admit that NATO, with the help of the Pentagon and CIA, carried out terror bombings in Italy and other European countries in the 1950s and blamed the communists in order to rally people's support for their governments in Europe in their fight against communism. As one participant in this formerly secret program stated, you had to attack civilians, people, women, children, innocent people, unknown people far removed from any political game. The reason was quite simple. They were supposed to force these people, the Italian public, to turn to the state to ask for greater security. And see this, Italy and other European countries subject to the terror campaign had joined NATO before the bombings occurred. And watch this BBC special. Pause, and as a quick aside, what is now known as Operation Gladio, named after the Roman short sword, was an astounding failure. Italian politics have been far left ever since. A U.S. congressional committee admitted that as part of its COINTELPRO campaign, and that stands for Counterintelligence Program, by the way, a program that is constantly and illegally used against the American people. The FBI had used many provocateurs in the 50s through the 70s to carry out violent acts and falsely blame them on political activists. An Algerian diplomat and several officers in the Algerian army admit that in the 1990s, the Algerian army frequently massacred Algerian civilians and then blamed Islamic militants for the killings. In 2005, a group of contractors from the Zapata Corporation fired at a United States Marine Corps outpost in Fallujah, Iraq. This odd occurrence was chalked up to the fog of war. Zapata Corporation is a CIA front company founded by former CIA Director George H.W. Bush. The apparent motive being, the more Marines get shot at and hurt in Iraq, the more contracts are delivered to Zapata and other mercenary organizations. War is business. Allies shooting at allies may come as an awful shock, but a very high-profile example cropped up later that same year, when 2 British operatives were apprehended by Iraqi police for shooting up the police station in Basra. The 2 commandos were dressed as Iraqi civilians, and at least one Iraqi minister accused them of fomenting sectarian violence in the Shiite-dominated southern province that bears the same name. Basra police suddenly were portrayed as crazed militia, requiring an astounding force of tanks and helicopters to quickly rescue the 2 offenders. This was in sharp contrast to the 15 sailors and Marines captured by the Iranian Navy 2 years later, whom British elites felt were of no high priority. Previous to modern times, empires and governments conducted false flags where their own citizens were killed to aggrandize the power of that empire. Today, Western administrators kill or pretend to kill their own citizens, but use the political capital to further enslave them as if they are the enemy. This, too, speaks of a malignant outside control. The Clinton administration would take the use of false flags against American citizens to shocking levels, only to be surpassed by the Bush and Obama administrations. Randy and Vicki Weaver were conspiracy theorists. They believed that their government was growing tyrannical and out of control. To them, it was only a matter of time before the freedoms they'd loved so well were all but memories. They decided to relocate to the mountains of Idaho and live off-grid. Once there, they became friendly with another separatist group, the Aryan Nations. As the name suggests, the group was profoundly racist, believing that super wealthy elites like the Rothschilds were part of a Jewish cabal pushing the New World Order. They made excellent targets for the Clinton administration. Both the ATF and the FBI were sent to create problems where they didn't exist, looking to infiltrate and entrap their victims, as they've done countless times before and since. The FBI has received substantial criticism over the past decade, much of it valid, but nobody can deny its record of excellence in thwarting its own terrorist plots. Time and again, the FBI concocts a terrorist attack, infiltrates communities in order to find recruits, persuades them to perpetuate the attack, supplies them with the money, weapons, and know-how they need to carry it out, only to heroically jump in at the last moment, arrest the would-be perpetrators whom the FBI converted, and save a grateful nation from the plot manufactured by the FBI. This from Tech Dirt. We've talked multiple times about how the FBI seems to spend an awful lot of time stopping its own terrorist plots, and it appears to have done so yet again. I Am the Key, I assume that's an insider blogger, whistleblower blogger, points us to the story of terrorist plot to blow up the Capitol averted, thanks to the fact that the whole thing was planned by the FBI. So it was pretty easy to stop the one dupe who thought it was real. Now, as some people always point out, these kinds of operations do seem to get people off the street who wouldn't mind causing harm to Americans, but it's unclear if any of them would ever actually have the means to do so in reality. What's telling is that these seem to be basically the only terrorist plots we hear about the FBI stopping these days, which makes you wonder if they just have too much free time to manufacture plots to stop. And this from the Associated Press. Defense lawyers in the trial of 7 Michigan militia members won a mistrial, claiming they should have been given details about the past work of an FBI agent who infiltrated the group. Attorneys found out only this week that Agent Stephen Haug was the handler for a New Jersey man who was paid by the FBI to collect information on white supremacists and hate groups starting in 2003. Pause as a quick aside. You never hear about the FBI infiltrating the Black Panthers. Back to the AP, the informant was a right-wing radio host and blogger who made threats against critics and public officials while on the FBI payroll. Attorney William Swore told the judge Wednesday that prosecutors had an obligation to turn over material that could aid the defense. The government says there was no violation. Militia members are accused of conspiring to commit rebellion. Conspiring to commit rebellion. There's a statute I'd like to see, but I'm not surprised. The ATF sent a snitch to Randy Weaver disguised as a fellow freedom fighter. At first, he asked for Weaver to get him an automatic weapon, but Weaver said he couldn't do that. Then they prodded him to saw down some shotguns, which was easy enough for Weaver to do. That was the hook they needed to extort Randy Weaver to become an informant on his Aryan friends, or so it was thought. When the ATF put the squeeze on Weaver, he reacted in a way they didn't expect. He told them he didn't care what they had on him and he wasn't going to turn. As a result, the ATF swore out a warrant for Weaver's arrest for altering shotguns below the legal barrel length, like they had asked him to do. Weaver decided to stay on his property and hunker down to make the government come to him, and come they did. They staked out the residence with surveillance cameras and snipers, but it wasn't long before Weaver sniffed them out, or rather the family dog did. 14-year-old Sammy Weaver was out with the dog when he rooted out a federal agent. They all tore off down the mountain until suddenly the feds opened fire, grievously wounding Weaver's dog. At that, Sammy tried to return fire, and the military-grade weapons the agents were using nearly sawed Sammy's arm off. In shock, he turned and ran up the access road, but federal agents riddled his back with bullets, killing him. The rest of the family scurried towards the house in response to the gunfire, not knowing what was going on. In the ensuing firefight, U.S. Marshal Bill Deegan was killed, Randy Weaver was wounded, and family friend Kevin Harris was also shot and wounded. Randy's wife Vicky ran to the door with 10-month-old Elishaba in her arms. FBI sniper Lon Horiuchi shot her in the face, splattering the infant with her mother's flesh. No doubt remained regarding what Horiuchi had carefully targeted with his state-of-the-art optics. A woman holding an infant. Vicky died slumped over her baby. Soon, the Idaho National Guard was called in with M113 armored personnel carriers, destroying all the family property outside the house and running over and killing another family dog, according to the testimony of Rachel Weaver.
I remember hearing people underneath the house rustling through our stuff. I remember the floodlights coming through the cracks of the curtains. And hearing their stupid, whatever they are, half tracks or whatever, rolling over stuff in the yard. They crunched our generator. They ran over our outhouse. Not to mention, down at the Y where everything happened, after they shoot the dog, and then my brother, they ran over the dog. It's just sick.
As the siege wore on, government agents mocked Weaver's grief from their savagery over loudspeakers. "Good morning, Mrs. Weaver. We're having pancakes. What are you having for breakfast?" Eventually, sympathetic civilian negotiators intervened on the Weavers' behalf and were able to talk the survivors down. Randy Weaver was acquitted of all charges. Not a single federal agent was fired, demoted, pursued, or prosecuted for the blood they spilled that day. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing was the efforts of Ramzi Youssef and Omar Abdel Rahman, a.k.a. the Blind Sheikh. Rahman was repeatedly granted freedom of movement to travel from Sudan to the United States to Egypt and back to America. This was touted by government and media reports as admitted errors. The FBI had a man on the inside the whole time. He thought he was there to stop them, but in fact, he was there to monitor their progress and facilitate the plot. There was a brilliant 2011 movie called The Veteran that depicted this sophistry perfectly. Directed and written by Matthew Hope and starring Toby Kebbell, a young British para, airborne soldier, is recruited by the Secret Service to, unbeknownst to him, ensure that the terrorists welcomed into Britain have all the drugs and guns they need to destabilize the UK. The answer to the resulting terror plots was to be more taxpayer investments into the military-industrial complex and the police state.
Hello, Jerry. Where is she?
We put her on a plane this morning. To the Lebanon. That's where she wanted to go.
Bullshit.
Is the gun really necessary?
Where is she?
The organizing principle of any society is for war. The basic authority of a modern state over its people resides in its war powers. Today, it's oil. Tomorrow, water. It's what we like to call the God business. Guns, oil, and drugs. But there's a problem.
I don't give a shit.
Our way of life. It's over. It's unsustainable and in rapid decline. That's why we implement demand destruction. We continue to make money as the world burns. But for this to work, the people have to remain ignorant of the problem until it's too late. That's why we have triggers in place. 9/11, 7/7, WMDs. A population in a permanent state of fear does not ask questions. Our desire for war becomes its desire. A willing sacrifice. You see? Fear is justification. Fear is control. Fear is money.
And even in that brilliant dialogue is still spin. This idea that humanity has used up all of its resources. And I'll bet you that there are probably assets and even agents. And if you recall, I told you the difference. An asset is expendable. An agent is highly trained and valuable. And as a result, is usually read in to some degree. There are probably even agents who are fed this similar line of BS. So they can basically serve, as we Christians would say, Satan, but Satan's nervous system, Satan's infrastructure is Rome. This is a real agenda that's working like a charm, even in Great Britain. This from Wired. The UK has more CCTV cameras per capita than any European country, yet figures released in July 2009 by the European Commission and the United Nations showed Britain's recorded rate of violent crime surpassed any other country in Europe. Imad Salem was an exceptionally accomplished Egyptian intelligence operative who had penetrated the jihadist cell planning to bomb the World Trade Center. He worked to painstakingly ingratiate himself with the blind sheikh, and the FBI was in touch with him regularly. The plot continued to mature until Rahman began to pressure Salem to build the bomb for the conspirators. Salem told his FBI handler he was in a bind. What should he do? The response came back, build the bomb. Salem was so shocked by this that he thought he was being set up and immediately began recording his conversations with the FBI. Salem built the bomb for Rahman, Youssef, and the FBI, and then suddenly the FBI...
Last winter, the FBI was praised for its speed in cracking the case of the World Trade Center bombing and bringing 4 suspects to trial. Now, there is some evidence that the FBI may have known of the plot in advance through an informant and might even have stopped the bombing that killed 6 people. Correspondent Jacqueline Adams has the story.
FBI agents might have been able to prevent last February's deadly explosion at New York's World Trade Center. They discussed secretly substituting harmless powder for the explosives, but they didn't, according to the FBI's own informant, Imad Salem. Unbeknownst to the FBI at the time, Salem recorded many of his conversations with his handlers.
I'm holding 903 pages of draft transcripts.
William Kunstler represents Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman and several others charged with conspiring to blow up a series of New York City landmarks 4 months after the World Trade Center bombing. That case has not yet gone to trial. Kunstler confirmed newspaper reports of the Salem transcripts. In one, Salem complains to an FBI agent, "Since the bomb went off, I feel terrible. I feel bad. I feel here is people who don't listen." The agent replies, "Hey, I mean, it wasn't like you didn't try and I didn't try. You can't force people to do the right thing."
There is material in here to show gross governmental misconduct.
Today, attorneys for the defendants in the ongoing World Trade Center bombing case formally asked for the transcripts of Salem's tapes.
Quite frankly, beyond me, why now, the 4th week into the trial, we still don't have these materials.
Prosecutors have refused to comment publicly, but legal experts say the defense may have no right to those transcripts.
It's not a defense to a crime to say, if only the government had stopped me, I wouldn't have done it. So this isn't material that ordinarily the defense would be entitled to.
In court today, a witness from the Ford Motor Company linked debris recovered from the explosion site to a Ford van where defendant Mohammed Salamat was arrested less than a week after the bombing. Jacqueline Adams, CBS News, New York.
Lost track of the lot of them, just as the DOJ and ATF lost track of the machine guns, sniper rifles, hand grenades, and explosives they had given to the Sinaloa drug cartel. The subsequent detonation in World Trade Center 1 resulted in 6 deaths but no appreciable damage to the building. For those within the United States government treasonously planning to kill Americans with as much shock as possible for political use, it was clear that more preparation was needed. The next time an event was planned, they would have to spend extensive effort towards more thorough and exotic forms of demolition and keep the truck bombs as cover for the public. Fox News is one of the most popular mainstream news outlets in America. It is strongly contrasted by the overt left-wing bias of the other news agencies, featuring supposed right-wing ideologues like Irish Catholics Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
What Fox News has become is the creation of Australian billionaire Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch's lesser-known accolades are that he is a Knight of Malta and a Papal Knight of St. Gregory. A frequent guest of Hannity and O'Reilly is New York prosecutor Andrew McCarthy. McCarthy had prosecuted the blind sheikh for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and later wrote a book on the event titled Willful Blindness. The book was red meat to the Fox News audience. Political correctness had enabled an Islamist threat to outwit a hamstrung but dutiful FBI. In his book, McCarthy admitted that he had seen firsthand the repeated missteps and mistakes the FBI had made, yet failed to accuse FBI leadership with anything more than willful blindness. Perhaps a cursory look at New York prosecutor Andrew C. McCarthy will explain his lack of vision. A graduate of Cardinal Hayes Catholic High School in the Bronx, a graduate of Jesuit Fordham University Law School, and an outspoken proponent of destroying the Bill of Rights in favor of fighting the so-called War on Terror. Randy Weaver was going to trial for refusing to help the government fabricate a terror threat. The FBI and ATF were already on their next assignment, the takedown of more apocalyptic Christians, this time in Waco, Texas. The Branch Davidians were an offshoot of Seventh-day Adventists who considered the United States government to be the whore of Babylon. As one Davidian blog stated, in Revelation chapter 17, it states that a figurative woman that represents the USA's capital leadership is figuratively drunk with confusion, Babylon in her forehead, referring to her way of thinking, mind, forehead, on her own wine, referring to her ideals and visions. Seventh-day Adventists are some of the most outspoken critics of the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order via their best teachers such as Walter Veith, Doug Batchelor, and Bill Hughes. And by the way, since writing this, I've had quite a terrible experience with Doug Batchelor and suspect he may be a Freemason because sadly the founder of the Adventist religion, William Miller, was also a Freemason. 1929, strict Adventist and Bulgarian immigrant Victor Tasho Hutev presented SDA leadership with his vision of the 144,000 remnant listed in the book of Revelation titled The Shepherd's Rod. Adventist leadership shunned Hutev's vision and he was disenrolled. He subsequently began the Branch Davidian movement based upon his teachings. It's likely that the Davidians of Texas were outside of the mainstream enough as to elicit their being targeted by Bill Clinton and his Attorney General Janet Reno. It's no coincidence that the Seventh-day Adventists are high on Rome's hit list. The conspirators felt that Waco Davidians were separated enough from other sects of Christianity that when they were persecuted, no other Christians would come to their aid. They were absolutely right. The Davidians had retreated to a compound in Waco and were awaiting the final judgment before Christ's return. They were living, quote, off-grid, end quote, and that was a problem for the United States government. Just as they did at Ruby Ridge, the ATF used the imprimatur of firearms violations to conduct an armed SWAT raid, but the Davidians were better prepared than the Weaver family. Only 2 days after the World Trade Center bombing, federal agents stormed the compound, but the Davidians resisted. Pause. I'm disappointed that I didn't make a point of this in the book. Only 2 days after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Now, this standoff immediately took over the news cycle. Lest you should examine the 1993 World Trade Center bombing too closely, and you find out that the Federal Bureau of Inquisition, also known as the FBI, was responsible for it. 2 hours later, 6 Davidians were dead, but so were 4 black-clad, assault weapon-wielding federal agents. All evidence of their thoroughly filmed raid was locked away or lost. 3 men who were outside the Davidian compound during the initial raid later attempted to return to their families after the shooting started. 2 were arrested. A third didn't fare as well. Sunday, February 28, 1993, Michael Schroeder, a Branch Davidian, is murdered, they say killed, while he tries to return to the main building. Texas Rangers begin an investigation, but are barred by the FBI from continuing. Michael's bullet-ridden, unarmed body was left to lay in a ravine for days after he was executed. This was done to send a message, just like the body of suicidal jumper J.P. Morgan technology chief Gabriel McGee was left on the adjacent rooftop 30 stories below for hours after police arrived for any other would-be banker whistleblowers to see. This day in history. Numbers are important to the Luciferian world elite. Significant dates are used to curry favor with interdimensional agencies as well as communicate the presence of their unseen hand. The span of 18, 19, 20 April throughout history has always been important to them. By the way, these dates expand if you also expand the range from, say, the 15th to the 22nd. The number of incidents are just astounding. When significant events are planned, this range of dates is a favorite. For the Jesuits, it begins with April 19, 1541, the day Ignatius Loyola became the first superior general. 21 April 753 BC, close enough to our span of dates, Rome was considered to be founded on this festival of the shepherd god of Pallas. 20 April 571 AD, held by many to be the birth date of the prophet Muhammad. 20 April 1889, Adolf Hitler is born. 19 April 1775, the first shot of the Revolutionary War is fired at Lexington. 19 April 1933, Franklin Roosevelt takes America off the gold standard. 17 April to 19 April 1961, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. By the way, that is not botched. That is the treasonously betrayed Patriots and their Bay of Pigs invasion. 19 April 1982, NASA declares Sally Ride an astronaut. 19 April 1989, 16-inch turret number 2 explodes on the USS Iowa, killing 45 sailors. By the way, that was a sabotage of a jilted homosexual sailor. 19 April 1993, FBI ATF slaughter 83 men, women, and children in Waco, Texas. 19 April 1995, 168 die, many of them children, when the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City is bombed. 19 April 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold murder 13 at Columbine High School. 19 April 2005, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict XVI. And 20 April 2010, British Petroleum's rig Deepwater Horizon explodes, killing 11. Thousands of animals poisoned in the Gulf. Now, citizen rights are far more curtailed, and the Davidians would certainly be convicted in a so-called court of law. In today's America, lifting your hands to protect your face during a law enforcement gang beating constitutes resisting arrest. One of the benefits of actually owning a copy of Illuminati Unmasked is if you want to go down this trail yourself. The breadcrumbs are there. The total count of American dead, not including government agents, was at least 83 that we know of. One of the federal snipers shooting women and children from afar during that siege was none other than FBI agent Lon Horiuchi. Was the FBI really at Waco to contain a siege, or were trigger-happy agents purposefully brought to the Davidian Church to finish off the job the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms botched? Yesterday, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported that FBI agent Charles Riley said all the way back in June 1993 that he heard shots fired from a sniper post occupied by agent Lon Horiuchi, according to court documents filed by Branch Davidians and relatives as part of a wrongful death suit scheduled to go to trial next month. Horiuchi was the paid assassin the FBI used on August 22, 1992, 8 months earlier to plug a fatal hole in the head of Vicki Weaver, an unarmed mother clutching her 10-month-old baby during a similar siege at Ruby Ridge, Idaho. It seems Lon Horiuchi is something of a specialist, the FBI's go-to guy when it's open season on women and children. Horiuchi was indicted for manslaughter by Idaho authorities for the shooting, but the charges were thrown out. And now we have reason to believe that 8 months after the incident at Ruby Ridge, one that ultimately cost U.S. taxpayers $3.1 million in a civil settlement with Randy Weaver, Horiuchi was assigned to another volatile siege with civilians, including women and children. In an interview with Rick Martin of The Spectrum, author Eric John Phelps implicated both Horiuchi and the FBI in a papal plot to punish American patriots. Martin: let me just back up here for a minute. What comes to mind is Louis Freeh, head of the FBI. Phelps: Roman Catholic, good altar boy. Probably a Knight of Columbus, I can't prove it. But anybody with that kind of power has got to be a Knight of Columbus. Oh, as an aside there, Eric, my former friend and neighbor, Louis J. Freeh is Opus Dei, and I can prove that. The Knights of Columbus implement Jesuit politics, and Louis Freeh was the one behind the Waco atrocity and the Oklahoma City bombing atrocity. His top sniper was a Japanese Roman Catholic named Lon Horiuchi. So it's Roman Catholics in control, Knights in control of the FBI, who carried out all of this killing. And those two men, Louis Freeh and Lon Horiuchi, are personally accountable to Cardinal O'Connor of New York. And Cardinal O'Connor of New York is the most powerful cardinal in the country. He is the military vicar. Cardinal O'Connor is the king of the American Empire, and he rules his empire from that palace, St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Little Vatican. All of this information is absolutely astounding and part of why it is my contention that Eric Phelps is an incognito Jesuit. And if that's true, he's part of a movement of rebellion, because even though he discredits himself with Jesuit eschatology and vicious, vehement racism, the information that he gives up is just absolutely astounding. Unfortunately, sometimes it's impossible to verify, but makes perfect intuitive sense. On April 19, 1995, 168 people, including 19 children, were killed in a bomb attack on the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City. I'm sure the number of children murdered, 19, also was not a coincidence. The iconic images of dead children helped dramatically increase the power of the federal government, as well as rocketed Bill Clinton into a second term. Since that terrible event, the accusation of Timothy McVeigh has silenced many a Christian, libertarian, constitutionalist, or pro-life activist, and has started an avalanche of ever more restrictive legislation like the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. This citation from the Federation of American Scientists: the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 is the product of legislative efforts stretching back well over a decade and stimulated to passage in part by the tragedies in Oklahoma City and the World Trade Center. Title I of the Act substantially amends federal habeas corpus law as it applies to both state and federal prisoners, whether on death row or imprisoned for a term of years, by providing a bar on federal habeas corpus reconsideration of legal and factual issues ruled upon by state courts in most instances, creation of a general 1-year statute of limitations, and pause as a quick aside, a year goes lightning fast in these situations. Creation of a 6-month statute of limitation in death penalty cases. Imagine that. Encouragement for states to appoint counsel for indigent state death row inmates. Pause. Now, any other circumstance, a monster that I am finding out oftentimes is created and enabled by Rome, will languish on death row for as long as 25 years. But when you're a patsy and a false flag, you have a 6-month statute of limitation on your death penalty. Encouragement for states to appoint counsel for indigent state death row inmates during state habeas or unitary appellate proceedings, and a requirement of appellate court approval for repetitious habeas petitions. The truck bomb that blew up outside the parking garage of World Trade Center 1 in 1993 was instructive to America's enemies, her own government. Although it was strategically parked next to support structures, little damage was done, and only 6 Americans lost their lives. A lot more damage would need to be done for a true political success. The apparent lesson learned there was pre-wire, and engineers and eyewitnesses would later claim that is exactly what they did in Oklahoma City 2 years later.
A truck bomb just delivers an air blast. That's all it does. It's called an air blast. And when you've got 8-foot thick columns of concrete filled with rebar the size of your arm, an air blast probably won't even break one. It will break windows. That's about it. But some of these columns were ripped up, shredded, tossed around.
Because a truck bomb is going to release its energy simultaneously in every direction. And so the damage pattern to the building or whatever structure it's parked in front of and intended to blow up, if it's a big structure, bigger than a truck bomb can take out, the damage pattern is going to be roughly a semicircle.
Now, I looked at the building. I was on the bomb squad for a couple of years. I've worked some bombings. And I looked at the building and I knew that the damage done to that building couldn't have come from a truck with ANFO in it.
A blast does not turn corners. And it did look like that there was a secondary explosion or a more intense explosion towards the east side of the building. Explosion, or that portion of the explosion, did basically clear everything from the front of the building to the south wall.
By the FBI's own admission, there were at least between 4 and 6 informants at Elohim City. I don't know what the population of Elohim City is, but it sounds like whenever 3 people get together to talk about overthrowing the government, 2 of them are working for the government. What was interesting, and I think no one has paid any attention to it, is that the CIA was involved at Elohim City. Not only were they involved, but they had the spy satellites. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I never heard of them before. They run the spy satellites. They had them over Elohim City. I think one of the things that may be most productive to getting at the truth was the discovery of an operation the FBI had in place since about 1991 called PATCON. P-A-T-C-O-N. It's short for Patriot Conspiracy. It was an idea they had to infiltrate every militia group, every neo-Nazi group, every group critical to the government in the United States. The plan apparently was to put informants in with all of these groups. And I think Elohim City was a PATCON operation. I think McVeigh was obviously involved in it. Now, whether he was a target or an operative, I don't know, any more than I know whether the government intended to blow up the Memorial Building. But they knew it was going to happen, and they knew McVeigh was going to do it, and they don't stop him.
When we interviewed Jane Graham, who was a survivor, she said that when she went to work, it was either the day before or 2 days before, I don't remember which, she parked in the basement parking, and when she got out of her car and was walking across the parking garage, she saw 3 guys down there wearing coveralls and placing putty on the columns and stringing wire between the putty. Later, she picks out one of the guys from photographs and says, that's him, and it was Andreas Strassmeyer.
Strassmeyer was there listening, going over the plans. He was listening to everything. He was, what they were talking about, looking at place, pointing to things. But when they were talking, whatever they happened to finally be talking about, and when I was looking at him, at that point, then he left and went over to the other side of the building so I wouldn't keep watching him. The second man that was there, who appeared to be military, he's the one that the man in charge told to put the stuff back in the car. The second man obviously was taking orders from the first man because he had wire in his hands, which I thought was telephone wire. It's that real light color, thin wire. And he also had what appeared to be gray putty.
Well, that's exactly how you string composition C4, with det cord.
In April of 2014, the false flag that was the Boston Marathon bombing was so evident to unbiased journalists and researchers that another serious event occurred as an apparent distraction. A fertilizer plant just outside of Waco, Texas, went up in an earth-shattering explosion. As amateur video began to emerge, it became clear that an airborne munition snaked its way through the smoke plume of the fire that was already raging to obliterate the entire building. The sound of inbound ordnance is distinctive and unmistakable.
We'll go to bushes first. They go all the way around the I'm sure they're close.
Was this the first instance of a drone strike on American soil? Residents were evacuated for considerable distances due to the danger of toxic fumes. These fumes were not present in Oklahoma City 18 years before. Evidence of pre-wiring, particularly of demolition infrastructure directly beneath the day room that produced such mortifying propaganda of dead and bloody children, may have been what got bombing first responder Oklahoma City Police Department officer Terrence Yakey tortured and killed. Sergeant Terry Yakey was one of the first emergency personnel on the scene after the bombs went off, and he immediately began saving lives and pulling people out of the debris, a feat that should have been impossible in the wake of an ammonium nitrate truck bomb. Yakey would later be found dead and pronounced to have committed suicide. The only reliable information regarding Terry and what happened to him came from his own family. A letter Terry wrote to bombing survivor Ramona McDonald clearly implied there were dangerous secrets Terry knew about regarding the bombing. It is now in the possession of Yakey's mother, Ludella. McDonald had received an anonymous call telling her to stop looking into what happened because it was part of an important government anti-terrorist operation. From the book Phoenix Rising. Ramona McDonald, who formed a group called Heroes of the Heart to bring a negligence suit against the federal government, was told that McVeigh was set up by an anonymous caller asking her to drop the case. The caller stated that the bombing was a failed sting operation where John Doe No. 2, also a federal agent, was supposed to defuse the bomb at the last second. Pause. If this sounds a lot like World Trade Center bombing number 1, that's because it is. It was a matter of national security, and we have no idea how many other bombs have been defused or attacks subverted due to these types of operations, he pleaded. Of course, no one would have believed the story if she hadn't recorded the entire conversation. Oh, don't go searching the internet for this conversation. You won't find it. The government has also told the public that an honest policeman named Terrence Yakey committed suicide due to his guilt about not being able to help more at the bombing or because of a failed marriage. What we are not told is that he investigated the crime despite being told to cease and desist, was taking video photos of the crime scene, and that he was cooperating with and had written a letter to Ramona McDonald. We were also not told that he feared for his life, so he took out an emergency insurance policy and told his former wife that they needed to get married so that the policy would be in effect should he be killed. By the way, an insurance policy doesn't pay for suicide. Other issues we weren't told included that there was no police investigation, no autopsy, and no attempt to lift fingerprints from the suicide despite being a standard procedure in the case of an officer's death. He was receiving death threats, and the investigation has remained sealed to everyone, including his family members. His family had their phone tapped and was under police surveillance after the suicide. His sister requested his video camera and any film that the officer would have had, and the police department would not give it to her. When they finally decided to give it to her, all the film was missing, later explaining that it was all pornography. There were also break-ins and thinly veiled threats against family members. And finally, just to add insult to injury, the police department wouldn't even pay for the funeral. On May 8, 1996, Sergeant Yakey tried to cut himself in the wrists, neck, and throat. Then, after losing approximately 2 pints of blood, got out of his car, walked 1.5 miles over rough terrain, crawled under a barbed wire fence, waded through a culvert, then lay down in a ditch and shot himself in the head. It was ruled a suicide on the spot and required no further investigation. Absolutely every cop privy to this criminal, this is me saying this as an aside, should have the exact same thing done to them. He was tortured to find out who he told about the truth. Imagine the level of corruption necessary for this to take place. Innocent people were slaughtered in a false flag bombing to include 19 children. A single street-level police sergeant is the only one who attempts an investigation. As a result, he is tortured and murdered. And all of his brother and now in modern days we would say sister officers, at least those around him who are privy to this, shut their mouths, let it happen, and let his family be punished because he was a good man. More specifically, the only good police officer in Oklahoma City. The only good, moral, ethical police officer in Oklahoma City was tortured and murdered. And that tells you everything you need to know about corruption and who runs America as well as the entire world. The New York Times would give an account of Sergeant Yakey's death. Noticeably absent from it were the details that pointed away from suicide and towards torture and murder. A police sergeant who rescued at least 4 people at the site of the Oklahoma City bombing committed suicide this week, but left no note, prompting friends and coworkers to speculate that he was driven by guilt at not being able to have saved more lives and by despondency over a troubled family life, the police said. The sergeant, Terrence Yakey, 30, was found on Wednesday in a field near his hometown of El Reno, about 30 miles west of Oklahoma City. Sergeant Yakey had apparently tried to slit his wrists, then shot himself to death 3 days before he was to receive the department's Medal of Valor, police said. I'll add as an aside, this is similar to San Jose Mercury News reporter Gary Webb shooting himself twice in the face. According to Ludella Yakey,
this is Ramona. Who's Ramona? As you were talking about. Didn't you listen? Well, I was flipping through the channel, watched for a little bit, but what's it got to do with anything today? It's got everything to do with what's happening today. We're under martial law.
Uh-huh.
And they were trying to get us under martial law way back 14 years ago. Mm-hmm. The bombing was to trigger martial law. Mm-hmm. They had the bill in front of Congress, and the Congress, we don't want to look at this stuff, we don't want to look at this. Well, so they had a bombing, no, we better do something. They can't connect the dots.
Yeah, pardon my French, but a little redneck like McVeigh.
Oh, he is
doing that and then getting stopped in Perry, Oklahoma.
With
no tag.
With no tag and a gun laying on the seat next to him.
And I have a big picture somewhere where you see ATF outside of the building, smoke still going up, and their car, when the bomb went off, it jammed 2 cars up against their car. So they're there in their trunk, putting on their jackets to pretend that they were in the...
You got...
There are pictures of this shit somewhere.
You got the pictures of this?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Find them.
I'm trying. Put this on the floor. I don't know. Look.
You see, once I put my stuff...
Yeah,
is it giving you conniption fits again?
No, I just want to know if it was working.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Okay,
let's take size picture of Terry Yakey roll down, and the man that was opening the door for everyone to go off into the site started to talk about Terrence Yakey. This was Officer Terrence Yakey, one of the first on the responders.
Lou, that was at the memorial. Right now down there at 5th Street. It's down there at 5th Street.
Yes, that's where it was.
And they had a big picture of your son as you walked in that museum.
Yes.
Now it's totally removed.
It's removed, nor is the man there anymore.
They don't talk about him anymore.
Not anymore. Real personal in here. This is all personal.
Rolling tape?
Yes.
So this is Sergeant Teriyuki's glasses he was wearing at that time?
With the blood.
Well, I don't know whether he was wearing them or not.
And you sure that's his blood on there?
That's blood. Somebody's blood.
Somebody's blood.
I don't know whose blood it is. This was all the stuff that they gave us coming from. I hope that you, whatever you hear now and in the future will not change your opinion about myself or others with the Oklahoma City Police Department. Although some of the things I'm about to tell you about is disturbing. I don't know if you recall everything that happened that morning or not. So I am not sure if you know what I'm referring to. The man that you and I were talking about in the pictures, I have made the mistake of asking too many questions as to his role in the bombing and was told to back off. I was told by several officers he was an ATF agent who was overseeing the bombing plot, and at the time of the photos were taken, he was calling in his report of what had just went down. I think my days as a police officer are numbered because of the way my supervisors are acting, and there is a lot of secrets floating around now about my mental state of mind. I think they are going to write me up because of my ex-wife and a DPO order. I told you about talking to Chaplain Poe. Well, the B wrote up in a report stating I should be relieved of my duties. I made the mistake of thinking that a person's conversation with a chaplain was private, which, by the way, might have cost me my job as a police officer. A friend at headquarters told me that Poe sent out letters to everyone in the department. That B I told you about is up to something, and I think it has something to do with Poe. If she gets her way, they will tar and feather me. I was told that Jack Poe has written up a report on every single officer that has been in to see him, including Gordon Martin and John Avera. Knowing what I know now and understanding fully just exactly what went down that morning makes me ashamed to wear a badge from Oklahoma City Police Department. I took an oath to uphold the law and enforce the law to the best of my ability. This is something I cannot honestly do and hold my head up proud any longer if I keep my silence as I am ordered to do. There are several others out there who saw, and even some who played a role in what happened that day.
Now this copy was printed off from his computer?
That Ramona said that came on her computer.
Oh.
Was sent to her by email or whatever.
Do you believe this to be legitimate from your son?
As talking with Ramona, yes I do. Even before the letter came, she contacted me and sent me other things that had happened at the bombing. And she told me why they had become friends. I guess they knew each other before, but
Ramona wouldn't have known Chaplain Poe's name, would she?
I wouldn't think so.
There's some details in here.
They had talked before. Terry and Ramona. They had talked.
What drove Ramona to the point where someone got her put away in a mental institution?
Ramona McDonald later suffered a broken marriage, financial hardship, and eventual commitment to a mental facility. Such an interment can be an extremely effective way of silencing dangerous witnesses. After the Oklahoma City bombing, there were reports of a John Doe number 2. These were very damaging to the official lone gunman explanation. Enter Salt Lake City attorney Jesse Trentadue. Jesse's brother Kenneth Michael Trentadue was a typical bad boy with a good heart. Frequently in trouble with the law, it didn't shock his brother when he was told that Kenny was again placed in jail in June of 1995 for violating his parole. In August of 95, Ken was transferred to the Department of Justice's Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma City. 3 days later, he was dead of an apparent suicide. The chief medical examiner for the state of Oklahoma at the time, Dr. Fred Jordan, felt otherwise. In a statement to local Fox 25 News, Jordan told reporter Phyllis Williams he felt Trentadue was brutally tortured and murdered by federal agents.
This is KOKH-TV, Oklahoma City.
From Fox 25, this is the 9 o'clock news.
I've made a lot of people very angry at me, and that's just a shame. Because I am trying to protect the public safety here, and it's just too bad. That's the way it's going to have to be.
Fred Jordan, the state's chief medical examiner, speaks out in anger about the mysterious death of Kenneth Michael Trentadue, a Fox 25 News exclusive. Good evening, I'm Kirsten McIntyre.
And I'm Damon Gardenhire in for Jack Bowen. Tonight, a major development in an ongoing Fox 25 News investigation. The state's chief medical examiner says it's taking too long to find out what really happened to an inmate who died inside Oklahoma City's Federal Transfer Center nearly 2 years ago. And tonight, Fred Jordan is demanding the local bombing grand jury investigate the mysterious death of Kenneth Michael Trentadue. Fox 25's Phyllis Williams has been following this case for more than a year now. Phyllis, Jordan really rarely gives interviews. Why is he doing it today?
Well, Damon, he says he's simply fired up and he wants action. Jordan says if Kenneth Michael Trentadue was murdered or if anybody else is murdered at the Federal Transfer Center, the public has the right to know. But Jordan says that's not happening. Do you believe he was murdered?
I think it's very likely he was murdered. I'm not able to prove it. I have temporarily classified the death as undetermined. You see a body covered with blood, removed from the room, as Mr. Trentadue was, soaked in blood, covered with bruises, and you try to gain access to the scene, and the government of the United States says, no, you can't. They continued to prohibit us from having access to the scene of his death, which is unheard of in 1997, until about 5 months later, we went in there and luminoled, and it lit up like a candle because of the blood still present on the walls of the room after 4 or 5 months. But at that point, we have no scene. We have no crime scene. So there are questions about the death of Kenneth Trentadue that will never be answered because of the actions of the United States government. Whether those actions were intentional or whether they were through incompetence, I don't know. And it's not easy to communicate with the federal government. It was botched. Or worse, it was planned.
Why is there a problem? Is there a problem?
Well, you tell me why there's a problem.
Is there a problem? Could it be because the family will not let this go?
Would you, if it were your relative?
There are some people who would question why you feel so strong about this case, because after all they go, it's just an inmate.
It's not just an inmate. Mr. Trentadue might be somebody I wouldn't let in my house. But let me tell you something. He's a human being, or was a human being. And I'm not saying I like these guys. I'm not saying I wouldn't be terrified if you put me out there with them. But I'm saying that they're our responsibility. And I'm saying that the investigation of their deaths is my responsibility as long as I'm chief medical examiner. And damn it, I'm going to do it, regardless of what I have to do. Now, the other thing is, do you think that the prison system, do you think that the court system is so accurate and so effective that there is no one in jail that's innocent? If you do, I have a piece of shore property just outside of El Reno. I want to sell you it. I think that we need an Oklahoma County grand jury made up of Oklahoma County citizens, in which the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Oklahoma, Mr. Ryan, can participate, where the people in Washington cannot forbid him to do that, that he can participate in our investigation as an Oklahoman, as somebody concerned about our city.
Have you tried contacting Reno?
Oh, yes. Yes, I have.
And what's happening?
Yes, I have. Let me tell you about that. Back when we were still investigating the bombing, because Mr. Trentadue died shortly after the bombing, I, the medical examiner for the state in which the Murrah building bombing occurred, made a call one day to Mrs. Reno's office. I told them who I was, and I said I would like to speak to an assistant U.S. attorney. I was told, you can't, none is available. But the door has been shut from Miss Reno's office to me as the chief medical examiner forever.
But you will fight for this county grand jury that's currently looking at the bombing to look at...
Yes, I will. And if that doesn't happen, I'll continue to fight in any way I possibly can. My job as chief medical examiner is, among other things, to investigate deaths that occur in prison.
Well, Jordan also wants the local bombing grand jury to tour the Federal Transfer Center and see if it's possible for an inmate to hang himself, as the FTC officials claim. And Damon, there is a new law that was signed in February that would give the medical examiner immediate access to a death scene at the Federal Transfer Center. But Jordan says that the feds are trying to block that. What they want him to do is have access, if only if they say the death is suspicious.
All right, good job, Phyllis. Stay on it for us.
Why would federal agents torture and kill an obscure convict? It all had to do with John Doe number 2. The official story about the Oklahoma City bombing has always been, quote, lone homicidal Christian militia constitutionalist Timothy McVeigh targeted the Alpha P Murrah building with an ammonium nitrate truck bomb. The Murrah building being the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Inquisition in Oklahoma City. Ken Trentadue was mistakenly ID'd as a possible John Doe number 2, Richard Lee Guthrie. If the government's lone gunman explanation was going to be kept alive, Ken would have to be dead, unbelievably at the hands of the FBI. It was Jesse Trentadue's Freedom of Information Act crusade that began opening the floodgates, which would later include implications that not only were there more than one perpetrator, but that the team was trained by our own government. And by the way, Jesse is Ken's brother. Thanks to evidence from the prison infirmary and coroner, it became quite apparent that lawmen from the FBI had tortured and murdered Ken Trentadue. Just like similar so-called miscues, this wasn't an interrogation gone wrong. It was standard operating procedure right from the pages of the Nazi SS or the Soviet KGB. Terminate loose ends. By the way, I was able to get in touch with and have him respond to me. Jesse Trentadue, former Marine and now a lawyer, Ken's brother, and I give him a note of thanks in the footnote on this page. The exact same scenario would play itself out when the FBI went to question Ibrahim Todashev, a friend of Boston bombing suspect Tamerlan Tsarnaev. Todashev was shot 6 times in the torso and once in the back of the head, execution style.
The FBI, honestly, has a really big mess on its hands. So maybe it is good that the FBI is about to get somebody new in charge for the first time in 12 years. The mess right now is about the Boston bombing. And the FBI's mess here is not just about the bombing itself. It's not just that they apparently closed their file on one of the 2 suspected bombers and then lost track of him before the bombing. The mess for the FBI here is also now about this. This is another young Chechen man who has reportedly not linked himself to the bombing or to radical ideology of any kind. But he did know the older of the 2 Boston bombing suspects when he lived for a time and practiced mixed martial arts at the same gym as one of the suspects in Boston. After the Boston bombing, this young man, Ibrahim Todashev, he was questioned in Florida multiple times about the bombing itself and about his ties to the bombing suspect. But last week, while he was being questioned again in Florida, something went very, very wrong, and he ended up dead. Law enforcement, including FBI agents, were questioning him in his home in Orlando last Wednesday when something happened. And this 27-year-old who was being questioned, this Ibrahim Todashev, he ended up dead. Well, today in Moscow, that man's family held a press conference at which the dead man's father held up and distributed photos. I have to give you a warning that these images are a little bit graphic. He distributed photos that he said were taken of his son's body after it was autopsied. We are being told that the autopsy report is not likely to be released for months because of this ongoing investigation, but we now have these photos because the body was released from the morgue to the next of kin in Florida, and his son's friend, the young man who you see here, who is also Russian, who was also questioned by the FBI, he says he took these photos of his friend's body, and he gave those photos to the guy's family in Russia. And that led to today's press conference in Moscow, with the family showing these photos and demanding answers for what happened to their son. Now, we have not been able to authenticate these photos. Nobody has. And the medical examiner today did not confirm to us by the time we went to air that these photos are actually of this guy and that these are real photos. But if these photos, and again, these are graphic images, if these photos are him, if these are his post-autopsy photos, if these are him and they are real, then something weird is going on. Because they appear to show that he was shot 6 times in the torso and once in the back of the head. The rear of his head, sort of at the crown of his head. How does that comport with the FBI's story that he was killed during questioning by armed agents who were only acting in self-defense? Shot 7 times, including in the back of the head?
Well, Rachel, every once in a while you can be so left that you're right. But I won't hold my breath waiting for you to follow up on this story. Perhaps the best document Jesse Trentadue freed from government files was the sworn statement of bombing co-conspirator Terry Nichols, where he implicated high-placed government officials and agencies at every level of the bombing plot. Quoting from that document, I cannot possibly discuss in this declaration all the information I have concerning the Oklahoma City bombing and others involved, but crucial parts of this terrorist act remain hidden from the American people, especially the identities of, quote, others unknown, unquote, who collaborated with McVeigh in the bombing. One was acting as a government provocateur. The other was a high-ranking federal government official. I believe both men are now being protected by the federal government in a cover-up to escape its responsibility for the loss of life in Oklahoma. In December of 1992, Timothy McVeigh told me that while he was serving in the United States Army, he had been recruited to carry out undercover missions. McVeigh did not say who recruited him or specify the nature of his mission. McVeigh did say, however, that he was to begin making contact with a, quote, network, end quote, of people after the first of the year, and that he was to take no action in furtherance of this mission until called upon. McVeigh said he would soon be making his first contact down south. McVeigh's first contact came 1 month later in Florida. It was with Roger Moore, a gun dealer who lived in Royal, Arkansas. Not only does this bring us back to the president who didn't inhale.
When I was in England, I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it, and didn't inhale, and never tried it again.
Bill Clinton, but it ties a thread of treason and deceit that leads all the way forward to the Obama Justice Department and Eric Holder. At the time of the bombing, our current United States Attorney General, Eric Holder, was managing FBI sting operations for a sting operation, read, fabricated corrupt setup, as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia and sitting in line to take over as Deputy Attorney General, which he did in 1997. One of Holder's first jobs was to cover up the FBI's role in the bombing. James William Fulbright was one of the most powerful men in the Senate. He was also a communist and a vehement racist. In 1956, Fulbright signed the so-called Southern Manifesto denouncing school desegregation with then-Democrat and 33rd-degree Scottish Rite Freemason Strom Thurmond. Thurmond was protected at his Senate seat for an astounding 47 years and was replaced by a man of equally questionable loyalties, Lindsey Graham. Fulbright, who held office for 31 years, also helped filibuster the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and then refused to sign it after his friend Lyndon Johnson talked him into allowing cloture. Fulbright was a communist collaborator who repeatedly attempted to warm the American people to thoughts of life under shared property and wealth. In their dealings with the communist world, Fulbright declared Americans must abandon old myths and adapt themselves to new realities. The character of Soviet-American relations had changed. In this new era of peaceful coexistence, it was imperative that Americans adopt a more flexible, sophisticated approach to communism. We must dare to think unthinkable things. It was quite possible for freedom and democracy to exist in a socialist or communist country, the Arkansan pointed out. The United States was going to have to come to grips with the fact that Castro and Castroism were not going to disappear in a season. Pause. Why not? Because Fidel was a good Catholic communist. Back to the citation, efforts to bring Cuba down through a policy of political and economic boycott had failed. Pause. Imagine that. The CIA can murder a sitting president in broad daylight, but failed some ludicrous number over 600 times to kill little tin dictator Fidel Castro in Cuba. Back to the citation, although the Senate was virtually empty when Fulbright delivered old Nis the New Realities, oh what a coincidence that, the title of his filibuster speech, the wire services reported it verbatim on the 26th, and the national press gave it extensive and immediate coverage. Oh, I'm sure it was plastered everywhere. By the end of the week, virtually every press pundit of note had written at least a column on the speech. Fulbright shows his skill again, proclaimed Drew Pearson in the Washington merry-go-round. The significant thing about the recent Fulbright full-dress speech is that its author has an almost perfect score on foreign affairs, Pearson proclaimed. Pravda called Fulbright's speech a light which has lit up a new realistic tendency in Washington political thinking. Izvestia, the official newspaper of the Soviet government, devoted nearly 3 columns to a glowing appraisal. Cuba's unofficial minister in charge of revolution, Che Guevara, thanked Fulbright for recognizing Cuba is here to stay. During the heyday of communism in the 1960s, it was the agenda of the Luciferians to simply merge the U.S. with the USSR. When bank examiner Norman Dodd investigated tax-exempt foundations on behalf of Congressman B. Carroll Reese, he was shocked to be exposed to this agenda. In an interview with G. Edward Griffin, Dodd implicated both billionaires and intelligence agencies, mankind's foremost enemies.
Raul Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither had sent for me when I found it convenient to be in New York, asked me to call upon him at his office, which I did. And on arrival, after a few amenities, Mr. Gaither said, "Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves." And before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, "Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know." Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, "Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union."
Syndicated newspaper columnist Andrew Russell Drew Pearson was called on the carpet by Senator Joseph McCarthy for being a communist sympathizer, which he clearly was, but was defended by the only man who didn't vote for unfunding Un-American Activities investigations, J. William Fulbright. McCarthy's whole career was marked by playing dirty. This made him an appealing figure for controlled opposition. America had become so rife with blatant communists, from government to education to entertainment to media, that a little outrageous grandstanding and persecution was needed to give them all cover and sympathy. It was all organized by the Jesuits, secretly run by the Catholic Church, as is almost every controlled opposition source, from Joseph Farah's WorldNet Daily to Rupert Murdoch's Fox News. On the day that McCarthyism was born, an unseasonably warm spell was broken in Washington, D.C. It was January 7th, 1950, and record-breaking temperatures on the 6th that had reached 72 degrees gave way to return of winter cold. Winds announcing the cold front blew through the city at 40 miles an hour, causing minor damage to a couple of trees and a storefront window. That night, a meeting took place in the Colony Restaurant, a 4-star establishment in downtown Washington. Attending were 4 men: Georgetown University politics professor Charles Krause, attorney William A. Roberts, Father Edmund A. Walsh, a Jesuit and the head of Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. On February 9, 1950, a little more than a month later, McCarthy made his infamous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, Wheeling also the site of a Jesuit institution, back to the citation, announcing he had a list of the names of 205 communists in the State Department, in which I cite from the American Spectator how Joseph McCarthy's so-called Red Scare and witch hunts was a Jesuitical ruse of blown cover as cover. Many in the media, even the Catholic media, oh no. So how would the Spectator know the Catholic media had communists in them? Had no doubt that Walsh had been the spur that propelled McCarthy. The Catholic magazine The Churchman wrote in 1951 that McCarthy, quote, only fires the guns that are made for him by Father Edmund Walsh, S.J., end quote. Again, this is pure manipulation, blown cover as cover. The Christian Century referred to Walsh as McCarthy's advisor. In 1953, leftist journalist I.F. Stone claimed that McCarthy, quote, has had the guidance of Father Walsh, end quote. In McCarthy, the Man, the Senator, the Ism, published in 1952, Washington insiders Jack Anderson and Ronald W. May endorsed Pearson's account. When it came time to put Joe McCarthy out to pasture, it was Irish Catholic Eugene McCarthy, Democrat from Minnesota, that helped get the job done, along with Fulbright by Gene's side. Fulbright was institutional in herding America towards loss of sovereignty and answering to a centralized world authority. This from Encyclopedia Britannica. His most notable achievement in the House was the 1943 Fulbright Resolution, putting the House on record as favoring U.S. participation in a post-war international organization. This organization, at its founding in 1945, was named the United Nations. What he also did was carefully rear young William Jefferson Clinton, no pun intended, in the ways of communism. Bill Clinton got the Special Soviet World Tour. He was just like any other typical American student, helping Marxists in London tone down their anti-Vietnam War rhetoric to appear more publicly acceptable. Stepping up his campaigning against the war, Clinton joined meetings with Group 68, Americans backed by the pro-Soviet British Peace Council. Tariq Ali, the former radical student leader, described Group 68 as being on the soft wing of his hardline coalition. In the autumn, Clinton helped organize demonstrations outside the American embassy in Grosvenor Square. In the evening, protesters held a candlelit vigil attended by Jessica Mitford, the writer, and Paul Jones, the pop singer. A month later, Clinton took part in a weekend of demonstrations near Grosvenor Square. On the first day, protesters led by Vanessa Redgrave dropped cards with the names of war victims into a black coffin. On the second day, Clinton organized a church service to provide Americans with an alternative to more radical protests by British Marxists. He asked an American priest, Richard McSorley, to read a prayer at the service in St. Mark's American Church near the embassy. Father Richard McSorley was a Jesuit priest, quote, committed to pacifism, end quote. The company was holding Bill Clinton's hand all around the world and giving him big-name support for his communist activities. From there, it was off to the Soviet bloc for immersion in communist culture. More from that same report. One influential Johns Hopkins Asian specialist, by the way, Johns Hopkins owned by the Jesuits and the Catholic Church, linked to IPR was Chinese communist apologist Owen Lattimore, accused by Joseph McCarthy in 1950 of being Moscow's top spy and one of the principal architects of our Far East policy. Oh, by the way, I believe IPR is the intelligence front organization, the Institute of Pacific Relations. Another enterprise that gave the enemies of the West treasonous enabling, which you'd think would be the inverse of what intelligence agencies do, but actually it's what they do all the time. Back to the citation, declassified files available today indicate that while McCarthy was exaggerating by calling Lattimore Moscow's top spy, Lattimore had been flagged by the FBI as a suspected communist and potential security risk as early as May 1941, when he was being considered for position as the Roosevelt administration's political advisor to Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek. Pause. Of course, this was a position by which he could facilitate the betrayal of Chinese patriots, which is exactly what happened. Back to the citation, that December, McSorley would again encounter Clinton in Oslo, Norway. Clinton, who had recently spent Thanksgiving vacation in Ireland with his fellow moratorium protester Tom Williamson, was now on his way to the Soviet Union, following in the footsteps of his new roommate, Strobe Talbot. Talbot was a Russian affairs scholar and intern journalist for Time. As a quick aside, a rag founded by Knight of Malta William Randolph Hearst. Back to the citation, he had begun visiting Moscow in 1968 and had developed contacts in the USSR. In late 1969, after staying with Richard Stearns for a couple of weeks in October, Clinton began roaming with Talbot and their friend Frank Aller. Aller, a draft dodger and China scholar, was doing academic work similar to Talbot's, making trips to Switzerland to receive the unpublished notes of Edgar Snow, an academic advocate of the Chinese communists, who is linked to the old Institute of Pacific Relations network. So yes, that's what the IPR is here in this citation. Clinton's autobiography recalls how he often made Talbot and Eller breakfast while they were doing their work. Oh, isn't that nice? Clinton stayed in Moscow about 5 days. Several accounts say he left via the Soviet airline Aeroflot, but Clinton says, Nikki and her Haitian friend Helen put me on the train. In either case, Clinton's next stop was Prague, Czechoslovakia, where he arrived on January 6, 1970. There he looked up the family of his Oxford friend Jan Kopold. Kopold's family was well connected in Czech communist circles. Clinton received a guided tour of Prague from Marie Smirnova, the widow of Czech Communist Party hero Jan Smirnova, who was Jan Kopold's grandfather. Bill Clinton was made from the ground up by the Company of Loyola to be a weapon of mass destruction aimed at the heart of the American people. They would later do much worse with a puppet president who has been so completely manufactured, some seriously question if he was conceived in a test tube.